Hola, how you going? Yogi here. Do you think there are laws in schools which determine how many teachers must be present for a given number of students? If you've ever made pancakes, which I highly recommend, did you find there is a perfect amount of sugar that must be added to a given amount of flour and a given amount of milk to get the best tasting pancakes? Have you ever wondered how many hours of a sport you play in a day compares to the amount of time you spend watching television? In maths, we call the comparison of two or more amounts of the same type a ratio. This video is the first in a 7-part series looking at ratios. In this video, RAT001, we are going to look at how we can formally write ratios in maths. Let's use this example to go over some basics about ratios and how to write them. First of all, let's start with the definition of a ratio. A ratio is a comparison of two or more amounts of the same type. To answer the question in this example, we have to compare the number of bananas to the number of apples in the basket. Are we comparing amounts of the same type? You might be thinking, aren't bananas different to apples? Well, they are both types of fruits, and what we're comparing is the amount of one type of fruit to the amount of another type of fruit. And this fits with our definition of a ratio. Think about that for a moment. The question asks us to compare bananas to apples in that particular order. We can work out there are 5 bananas. Pause the video if you need to and figure out where 5 came from. And the question tells us there are 14 apples. We can write this comparison of bananas to apples in that order as a ratio. In maths, there are a few ways we can write a ratio. We can write the ratio in words. So for example, we could say the ratio of bananas to apples is 5 to 14, using this word 2. Another way we could say it is the ratio of bananas to apples is 5 is to. So using the words to or the words is to. Another way is to use a symbol which mathematicians prefer, and that in this case is the colon. So we could write that the ratio of bananas to apples is 5 colon 14, and the way we might think of that in our mind is 5 is to, or 5 to 14. The colon represents those words. And finally, if only two amounts are being compared, we can write this ratio as a fraction. So in this case, the ratio of bananas to apples is 5 over 14, the fraction 5/14. Whichever notation you decide to use, words, colon, or fraction, please note that the order of the amounts is important. In this example, we were asked to compare the fruit in the order of bananas first, compared to apples second. Writing the ratio 14 is to 55 would be incorrect in this example, because this would be comparing apples first to bananas second, which is not what the question asked for. What happens if we want to compare more than two amounts of the same type? Well, out of our 3 possible notations, using words, a colon, or fractions, fractions won't work. Can you figure out how to write the correct ratio answer in words to this question? In words or using the colon? Pause the video and write down your answer. Let's look at the original scenario again. In the fruit basket example, part of the basket was made up of apples, part of the basket was made up of oranges, and part of the basket was made up of bananas. Altogether, the whole basket was made up of 35 pieces of fruit. In writing ratios, we can write part-to-part ratios or part-to-whole ratios. For the fruit basket example, one possible part-to-part ratio would be the ratio of bananas to oranges. That is, 5 parts of the basket are bananas is to 16 parts of the basket are oranges. The ratio of bananas to apples we looked at previously, that is 5 is to 14, is another example of a part-to-part ratio. Can you think of 4 other part-to-part ratios. Remember, the order of amounts being compared is important. In this particular example, pause the video for a moment and see what you can come up with. We can also write part-to-whole ratios in this example. The ratio of apples to the total amount of fruits is 14:35. Can you think of another part-to-whole ratio for the fruit basket example? Did you come up with the ratio of oranges to the total amount of fruit is 16:35? If so, you're on the right track. A rule about writing ratios is that the ratio must appear in what's called simplest form. This is similar to what we have done with fractions in the past. A ratio can be simplified in a similar way to fractions, by dividing each number in the ratio by a common factor. If we divide by the highest common factor, called the HCF, we will obtain the ratio in its simplest form. For example, say a pancake recipe requires 2 cups of sugar for every 12 cups of flour. In this ratio, if it was written as a fraction, 2/12, it could be simplified by dividing both numbers, the numerator on top and the denominator on the bottom, by a factor of 2. So we can see that in this case, 2 is a factor of both numbers. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 12 divided by 2 is 6. The ratio could then be written correctly in its simplest form as 1:6, or the fraction 1/6. We can simplify a ratio even if it can't be written as a fraction. For example, the ratio 4:12:8 can't be written as a fraction because more than 2 amounts are being compared. However, we can still simplify this ratio by trying to identify the highest common factor. In this case, the highest common factor would be 4. 4 is a number that goes into 4, 12, and 8 as well, without leaving any remainders. If we divide each of these numbers in the ratio by the highest common factor, 4 divided by 4 is 1, 12 divided by 4 is 3, and 8 divided by 4 is 2. So we end up with the simplified ratio of 1:3:2, and that's the simplest form that we were looking for. Finally, one last point to note about ratios in this video is that ratios that only involve 2 amounts can be written as decimals or as percentages. For example, the ratio 2:5 can be written as the fraction 2/5. From your previous use of fractions, decimals, and percentages, you should realize that 2/5 can be written as the decimal 0.4 or as the percentage 40%. You might be wondering, how can 0.4, which only has one number, be a ratio? Isn't a ratio a comparison of 2 or more numbers? Well, yes, but a decimal like 0.4 actually means 0.4:1. The 1 is not written, but it is understood to be there. If the number in the ratio 0.4:1 was multiplied by 10, if I multiplied this side by 10, I would move the decimal point 1 place, and if I multiplied the other side by 10, this would become 10. So I'd end up with the ratio 4:10. A number that can go into both 4 and 10 without any remainder is 2. If I divide 4 by 2, which is the highest common factor, I get 2. And if I divide the other side by 2, I get 5, which is the original ratio of 2:5. So the decimal ratio 0.4 actually means 0.4:1, and this is equivalent to 2:5. Similarly, The original ratio 2:5 can be written as 40%. Now 40% means 40 out of 100. This can be written as the ratio 40:100. And again, if we look for the highest common factor, which would be 20, if we divide both sides of this ratio by 20, 40 divided by 20 is 2, and 100 divided by 20 is 5. And so we get back to the original ratio of 2:5. So a ratio comparing only two amounts can also be written as a fraction, a decimal, or a percentage. Okay, in this video we have looked at how a ratio is a formal mathematical way of representing a comparison of two or more amounts of the same type. We have seen that ratios can be written in words using the colon symbol, or when only two numbers are being compared, as a fraction, decimal, or percentage. We talked about the order of the numbers stated in a ratio being important, and how ratios can be part-to-part ratios or part-to-whole ratios. The important step of simplification was also discussed. People use ratios all the time in many different areas of life, from business to cooking to sharing pizza and splitting bills. Hopefully this video has given you some sense of why knowledge of ratios can be useful. In the next video, RAT002, I'll go into a little bit more detail about simplifying ratios. Until then, adios amigos, adios amigas.